Good morning. I'm Sharon Farb, the Associate University Librarian and the Chief Policy Strategist for the UCLA Library. I want to thank you all for joining UCLA Library for today's amazing program. So excited. Before we get started, the UCLA Library acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional caretakers of the Tovaangar, the Los Angeles Basin and the South Channel Islands. As a land-grant institution, we pay our respects to the ancestors, the elders, relatives, and relations, past, present, and emerging. As an uninvited guest, I want to express my deep gratitude to the Gabrielino Tongva peoples for their stewardship of the land, the water, and their ancestors since time immemorial. Today's program, Queer Migrations in the LGBTQIA Diaspora, is part of a series, Diasporas, Transnational Migrations, Spaces and Identities. The series aims to explore diasporas around the world from various lenses, personal stories, academic research, community endeavors, and art, in order to provide a better understanding of the experiences of migrants and their descendants in creating community, negotiating identity, and preserving and transforming cultural traditions. Before we get started, I just want to give a shout out to our esteemed and amazing panelists today, the organizers, and to everyone joining us. Thank you so much for making time to be with us today. Moderating this journey this morning is Ari Shaw. Ari is the Senior Fellow and Director of International Programs at the Williams Institute at UCLA. He specializes in international human rights, LGBTQIA, politics in the US and foreign policy. Ari was previously on the senior staff at the Columbia World Projects and has worked on human rights, global governance, LGBTQIA issues for Open Society Foundations, the Gill Foundation, and the Council on Foreign Relations, and the United Nations Association of the United States of America, among others. Ari holds a PhD in political science from Northwestern University, a master's in international relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a BA in government from Harvard College. Please join me in welcoming Ari, who will kick off and introduce our esteemed panelists today.
Thank you so much, Sharon, and thank you to the UCLA Library and the entire team for organizing this incredible and important discussion. I think this panel really comes at a critical time where a number of global political, economic, and environmental challenges impact both migrants and LGBTQIA people broadly around the world. As of 2022, more than 100 million people were forcibly displaced worldwide by persecution, violence, conflict, and human rights violations. Among them are refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced people, and stateless people who seek protection from discrimination and persecution related to their either real or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics. Currently, more than 60 countries criminalize consensual same-sex relations, and 14 have laws that criminalize transgender people's gender identity and expression. And even in countries that no longer formally criminalize LGBTQIA people, there may be no legal protections that exist, and this enables severe human rights violations and widespread social and economic exclusion. As a result, many queer people must often flee their home to seek security and basic human needs in another country. The panel today will examine different aspects of queer migration and these issues above. Who are queer migrants? What are the particular barriers and vulnerabilities that they face? How are queer migrants resilient and able to form community in the face of such challenges? How does the experience of migration shape and interact with various forms of queer identity, expression, and representation, and of course, many other questions that flow from these important issues. To take these on, we have an absolutely stellar panel of experts who I'll introduce in turn with each of their respective presentations. To start, we'll begin with Anja Limon, who's Senior Program Manager at the Organization for Refuge, Asylum and Migration, or ORAM. Anja is based in ORAM's Berlin office and holds an LLM in International Law from the University of Bristol, where she focused on migration law and policy. Before joining ORAM, Anja worked at a law firm in Ljubljana, Slovenia, and Anja joined ORAM in Tel Aviv in 2017, during which time she was working with Amnesty International, with Eritrean and Sudanese refugees in Israel. Anja, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen. Hey, hi everyone, and I'm really happy to be here today. So as Ari said, my name is Anja Limon, pronouns she, her, and I'm the Senior Program Manager at ORAM, which is the Organization for Refuge, Asylum and Migration. So who is ORAM and what do we do? So we are a US-based nonprofit organization. We were founded in 2008, but we also have an office and entity in Germany, Berlin as well, which is where I am based. So ORAM is one of the first international organizations to focus really on working with LGBTIQ asylum seekers and refugees globally. And we've worked in a number of different regions, including the MENA region. We've worked in Central America, across the African continent, and most recently also in Europe, supporting queer Ukrainians who have been fleeing Ukraine because of the war. Our programs really depend a lot on what region we work in. We make sure that all our programs really meet the needs of the people we serve, so LGBTIQ asylum seekers and refugees, and that we're really filling the gaps that may not be filled by other organizations working with mainstream asylum seekers and refugees in that country. And just a few examples of what we do is livelihoods projects. Under that falls economic empowerment, training and education of people to be able to generate income in countries where refugees aren't able to work. We do a lot of capacity building, and this really goes hand in hand with us focusing a lot on partnering with grassroots organizations. Where possible, we partner with LGBTIQ refugee-led, community-based organizations on the ground in countries that we work in. Really want to empower them to be able to do the work, really empower those with lived experience. And through that, we then also provide this capacity building to enable these organizations to be the ones on the ground working with the community. We also do a lot of advocacy around queer migration in the broader migration space, emergency response, hand in hand with various crises across the world, and also in the past, legal representation of asylum seekers and refugees fleeing because of persecution based on their sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. Mentioned a bit of this as well, but one of the main things about us is, despite being based in the US and having an office here in Berlin, we really work in what we call transit countries or countries of first asylum. And the reason for that is really that we are a small organization, and we really want to make sure that we focus on countries where there maybe aren't organizations providing this support. And these will be countries predominantly in the global south where, especially in countries where it is maybe still criminalized or where there's strong social stigmatization against the community. And therefore there may be is a lack of support on the ground, whether it's national organizations, also just broader humanitarian agencies or refugee-serving organizations that may not be meeting all the needs of LGBTQ refugees and asylum seekers. So really, why are people fleeing and how are they fleeing as well? So Ari mentioned that there are nearly 70 countries around the world now where same-sex acts are still criminalized. But even where it's not legally criminalized, what's important to mention is this social stigmatization. So actually, there are many countries where it may not legally per se be forbidden to be part of the community, but you may be face persecution from non-state actors, and those may be your family, friends, your neighbors, teachers, employers. And often that can even, be worse maybe than when it's legally criminalized, because there are also quite a few countries, for instance, that do legally criminalize, but these laws may not be implemented as such. And that's often one thing that's really important to think of, because when someone flees from such a country and when they seek asylum, often decision makers will only look at what the laws are and not what the norms are, and cultural, political, religious norms in a country that can then lead to persecution and reason why people will be fleeing as well. One important thing to mention that's often a bit confusing is, the term asylum seeker, refugee, what's the difference? And one thing is that, first of all, to be an asylum seeker or a refugee, you need to be outside your country of origin. So you already need to have crossed an international border to be able to seek international protection, or other protection from that country that you've fled to. And the reason is that, this is, international protection. So you can't be in your country and seeking that protection to be an asylum seeker or refugee. And one thing that people maybe in the US or Europe often don't think of is that most people don't have the ability to just hop on a plane and fly to a safe country in Europe or the US or Australia or Canada. Most people will end up fleeing to neighboring countries. And, that will mean just crossing an international border, the first border that you have, by foot, by ground transport, because most people don't have the financial means to, first of all, to be able to jump on a plane and fly somewhere safe. And secondly, also, most people from countries where people are fleeing from won't even be able to get a visa to be able to enter that country. So, for instance, they won't be able to get a tourist visa or a student visa, any kind of other visa that would actually allow them to reach safety directly. So that's what we mean when we talk about countries of origin, so where people are actually from, and then transit countries and countries of first asylum, so the countries that people are passing through, and then safe third destination countries that tend to be the ones that people actually intend to go to. So again, like Northern America, Europe, Australia, maybe New Zealand. But again, most people will have a pretty long journey to be able to get there. In order to be able to reach these countries, you will first need to apply for asylum in this transit country or country of first asylum. You'll need to go through the whole asylum process in that country, and only then will you potentially be able to get resettled, which means relocated to, again, Northern America or Europe. And Ari mentioned the number of people that are displaced around the world. And sadly, currently, there are less than 0.6% of all refugees that will even be able to get resettled to safe third countries. And the reason for that is that our governments in these countries are not always willing to accept so many refugees through resettlement. And what that means is that a lot of, or most LGBTQ asylum seekers or refugees will actually be stuck in these transit countries, countries of first asylum, for a prolonged period of time. And that can be usually the minimum 5 years, 10 years, and sadly, often for the rest of their life. Many people sadly will never have the opportunity to actually get resettled. And one thing that's important to mention is that these neighboring countries will most often be politically, culturally, socially very similar to the country that they actually fled from in the first place. So by crossing just a land border, you're not usually going to be able to enter a completely different country. If we're thinking about Africa, for instance, if you cross from Uganda to Kenya, the situation for LGBTIQ communities will not be that different just because you cross that border. And that's really important to keep in mind when we are working with LGBTIQ asylum seekers and refugees, because it's important to understand the journey that they go through. So, the violence and persecution that they will face in their home countries, countries of origin, often continues in these first countries of asylum and transit countries. And actually, sometimes it can be even worse because of double stigmatization. So now not only are they discriminated against or persecuted because of their sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression? But they're also foreigners in these countries as well. And they have a status of being an asylum seeker or a refugee. So there's that double stigmatization and marginalization that really often leads to, severe isolation of these individuals. And that, of course, will lead to mental health issues, difficulty accessing employment or education. It's very difficult often to access healthcare at all. You have language barriers, which basically mean, again, that it will be difficult to find a job and generate income or be able to educate yourself further. And also just a lack of services available to meet the challenges and needs that you do have, as well as also linked to the lack of employability, then also the challenges just of financial stability as well. And these are all challenges that a lot of refugees in general will face in these transit countries or countries of first asylum. But the LGBTIQ community on top of that will just face further discrimination, again, because they usually are in countries where it will still be criminalized or strongly socially stigmatized. Another difference between LGBTIQ refugees compared to maybe refugees fleeing for other reasons is that LGBTIQ individuals tend to flee their countries alone and at a very young age. So whilst other refugees that are maybe fleeing for other reasons, such as maybe war, often flee with family, friends, as a community, LGBTIQ individuals are often fleeing from their family and from their friends and will flee alone, and therefore often also sadly be alone in these countries of asylum as well, meaning that they'll have very little emotional support. And as I mentioned, they're also usually very young as well. In countries that we work in, most of the people that we work with will be between the ages of 18 and 25. And as you can imagine, it's very difficult to go on that journey alone, especially at such a young age as well. And that again leads to this isolation of not, even accessing information of what rights you do have as an asylum seeker or refugee, what rights you have as an LGBTIQ individual in these countries, and just that emotional support that you need to go through the difficulties that you do face on a daily basis. And again, it's important to understand that because all these factors will play into their emotional stability and just generally their journey, even once they arrive maybe in these destination countries that we're talking about as well. So those who are lucky enough to be able to get resettled and let's say make it to North America will still need a lot of support. And actually one thing that we've seen is that many people who do get resettled, once they do get resettled, after about 6 months, the adrenaline kind of dies down a little bit and people realize that, they've reached that safety that they were always looking for, but then don't really know how to start their new life. And these are people who have gone through challenges from their childhood that they, have been struggling with and not been receiving the adequate support that they would need. And that means that once they do make it to safety, they need additional support to be able to, build a new life and make it further. And these are some of the basic needs that, they do have. So shelter, regular psychosocial support, access to education, because again, usually they're so young that they maybe weren't able to finish their education in their home countries. In first countries of asylum, they're usually not able to access any education. And then also just, of course, access to the labor market. One important aspect is language courses to actually be able to integrate into society. And then just also, the basics of kind of building their new family, building connections, building friendships, and then also cultural orientation. And this is something that, again, is often forgotten about when we're speaking about refugees coming to safe third countries, is that they will have often come from completely different backgrounds, and they're not always able to just kind of melt into the LGBTIQ community in North America, but they'll need that time and space to be able to find themselves and fit themselves into this new reality that they're living. And I think I'm at time now, so thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anja. That was a terrific overview and place to start. Just a quick note to attendees. There was a note in the comments, but I just wanted to remind everyone here that there will be time for question and answer after the presentations, as well as you're able to submit questions throughout in the Q&A function on Zoom. So please feel free to contribute those, and we'll get to as many as we can. Next, I'd like to turn to Ruben Zecena. Ruben is an assistant professor of English at Texas State University, where he specializes in contemporary Latinx literature and culture, and he engages that through the frameworks of queer migration studies, border studies, queer of color critique, and women of color feminism. His scholarship appears in the journals WSQ, Women's Studies Quarterly, Diálogo, an interdisciplinary studies journal, Studies in Spanish and Latin American Cinemas, amongst others. He's currently working on a monograph about the cultural productions of queer and trans migrants in the US. Ruben, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. This is a wonderful space. I'm very appreciative of the organizers and everybody at the UCLA Library and International Center, and definitely the fabulous co-panelists. And I want to start by acknowledging I'm formerly undocumented. I'm a queer migrant from El Salvador. That said, I got my citizenship like 2 years ago, which was cool. But at the same time, it puts me in a position of privilege. So anything I say here today has to do with, it's also impacted by, again, the privileges that have been afforded to me as a US citizen. So today I'm going to be presenting on a chapter from a book I'm working about that focuses on the cultural productions of queer and trans migrants, because I'm really invested in the politics of representation, particularly when US media and a lot of photojournalists depict migrants through a dehumanizing lens. And we can see this with the depiction of Central American migrants crossing the border, or depictions of photojournalistic images of dead migrants on the river that are shared through social media. These are many events that speak to why it's important to talk about cultural representations. So I'm going to be presenting about a moment of resistance in how queer and trans migrants are represented, which occurred with the Caravana Trans Gay Migrante, the Trans Gay Caravan of 2017. And the presentation is titled Migrating Like a Queen, Visuality and Performance in the Trans Gay Caravan. So for a brief overview of what I'm going to be looking at today, I'm going to start by thinking about the terms diaspora and thinking about LGBTQ communities and migrations together. Then I'm going to provide brief background on the Trans Gay Caravan. I'm going to analyze one testimonio that emerged from the Caravana. And then I'm going to be analyzing photojournalistic practices that represented the Trans Gay Caravan, and end with an allusion to the implications and futures of how do we represent queer and trans Latinx migrants. So the term diaspora is an interesting one. It references the dispersal and movement of populations. Its Greek root comes from the word diasporein, which means to disperse. Dia means across, sporein means to scatter. And a lot of theorists in the field of queer diaspora studies have noted that there's a patrilineal logic to this term diaspora, as it has a lot to do, again, with this dispersal of seeds, which brings connotations in religion with sperm. And because of that, queer diasporic studies scholars have noted that there's something interesting that's happening between diaspora and patriarchal notions of nation building and nationalist belonging. The theorist Gayatri Gopinath writes that queer diasporic expressive culture and everyday forms of queer diasporic world building articulate radically expansive visions of home and belonging, kinship and community that are not beholden to heteronormative and patrilineal logics of what we normally depict of as a diaspora. LGBTQ migrations and diasporic people signal this type of movement that challenges heteropatriarchal constructions of how do you belong to the nation? Which nation do you belong to? In the image depicted here, this is from one of the caravan members. She's holding a sign that says, Las mujeres trans pertenecen aquí. Trans women belong here at the US-Mexico border. This occurred in Nogales, Arizona. And what's interesting is that, again, it's making a claim that trans women belong here. The here is in the space of both the US and Mexico. It is quite literally at the edge of these transnational borders. And in doing so, she is imagining a different type of belonging that is different from patriarchal constructions of the nation. So I'm going to begin reading from the paper that will provide more background on the caravana. So on August 10, 2017, a group of 11 trans women and 6 gay men traveled to the port of entry in Nogales, Arizona to ask for asylum. They constitute the first trans gay caravan to cross the US-Mexico border together, and they call themselves Arcoiris 17, Rainbow 17. This name is distinctive of their many backgrounds, as many of them cross multiple borders coming from countries in Central America and also Mexico, while experiencing brutal forms of violence along the way. Arcoiris, which translates to rainbow, is a fitting name since many of the members cross the border while wearing tiaras, heels, and rainbow flags. The majority of the caravan members met at La 72, a migrant shelter on the Guatemala-Mexico border that is known for being one of the few shelters that supports and dedicates resources for LGBTQ migrants. And this point is crucial as a lot of migrant shelters are exclusive of particularly chicas trans women. Before surrendering themselves at the port of entry, the caravan held a march that lasted 2 hours on Nogales' Calle Internacional. This is the street that is being depicted in this image. This performative march was documented by multiple media outlets and included colorful banners, animating political chants, and spectacles of high femme fabulosity. The march was organized with the help of Nakai Flote and Irvin Mondragon, who volunteer with La 72 and are founding members of the organization Diversidad Sin Fronteras. Following the march, the caravan members walked to the gates of the US-Mexico border with a strong determination to not be separated from each other or be held in detention. These liberatory aspirations, however, were terminated when border officials held the entire caravan overnight and transferred them to different detention centers in New Mexico. Before their actual crossing, when they surrendered themselves to migration control, they held a press conference where individual testimonios were connected to larger community struggles and experiences. The press conference began with a testimonial from one of the members named Alexandra, who stated, "We come seeking the necessary security and protection as human beings who deserve liberty, who deserve happiness, who deserve the right to form our own opinions. We feel obligated to come here to ask for asylum in our quest for liberty. We are talking about a vulnerable group. We are unknown in society, and it is because of this that we feel obligated to ask the US government to allow us to leave under parole detention." It is important to note that Alexandra repeats "we" to show that epistemic violence is a shared experience amongst LGBTQ+ communities. She strategically poses queer and trans migrants as vulnerable groups in order to prevent detention and at the same time to claim a right to appear in public, to be present, and to be fully visible. Because asylum cases can take many years and detention centers are notorious for placing trans women in solitary confinement, her request for parole detention is an act of survival. Her expression of how LGBTQ migrants are unknown in society also indicates the particular struggles of her trans sisters. Being unknown in society means being erased, exiled, and cast out of the nation, or in other words, to be put into a detention center. After the march, all of the trans women were taken to the privately run Cibola County Detention Center in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and they were released under parole after a month of detention. And if this name is familiar, it is because this is the same detention center where Rosana Hernandez, a trans Latina migrant from Honduras, died in 2018 from lack of medical care and the violent treatment and negligence of migration control. While Alexandra's testimonio did not prevent immediate detention, she was able to call attention to the violence that trans and queer migrants experience through transnational migration and the displacement from their homes. She utilizes testimonio to request rights from the nation, while at the same time critiquing the violence of US immigration control. Ultimately, the testimonio provided a tool for Alexandra to shift the focus away from the individual and to bring visibility to collective movements, struggles, and aspirations as a starting ground for liberation. Because video and photography were an important aspect of the Transgay Caravan, I want to highlight the visual registers through which the protest was documented. And here I analyze in particular the photojournalism of Maria Inés Taracena, who does not merely document violence and the plight of LGBTQ migrants crossing the border, but also attunes her visual lens to the everyday pleasures, struggles, and scars of transnational migration. Taracena is a news production fellow at Democracy Now! Who documents borderlands activism and transnational migration struggles through multimedia narratives. I bring attention to her photojournalism because she provides a lens from which we can see, feel, and understand what it means to inhabit border spaces with dignity. A compelling feature of Taracena's coverage of the Transgay Caravan is her keen attention to the embodied experiences of migration. When writing about one of the caravan members who migrated from Central America, Taracena turns attention to the body when she observes, quote, "Stephanie has many scars. Some are visible on her face, lifelong reminders of the death threats and abuse she survived in Honduras. She has short, curly black hair. Her brown eyes are round and wide. She wears bright pink lipstick and her lashes stretch all the way up to her eyebrows." Sadly, I couldn't find an image of just Stephanie, so this is an image of somebody else, Jocelyn. In alluding to the scars in Stephanie's face, Taracena is sharply attuned to the social and embodied injuries that trans women are subjected to in their home countries. Taracena's descriptive writing also sheds light on the everyday realities in Stephanie's life. While Stephanie has suffered many losses, the bright pink lipstick and her long lashes serve as a form of self-fashioning in which she lays claim to her body and her right to exist in the public sphere. With her lashes stretching up to her eyebrows, Stephanie's also bringing glamour to the spaces that she inhabits. Unlike the solidarity aesthetics of dominant photojournalistic practices covering Central America, which create unilateral relations of power, Taracena's photojournalistic focus on the ordinary, such as this image, remaps the visual economies of power between the global North and the global South. This type of journalism reinterprets the world by enabling something frivolous like long lashes and something painful like scars to become starting points for political movements. This expression of desire, pleasure, joy, and violence is visually represented at the border through this notion of touching, which I'm going to explore in this image. The Queens of Rainbow 17 bring tender, touching, and relational performances to the lens of the camera. Here's an image of Taracena where she is depicting Jocelyn and Stephanie, members of the caravan, who are holding each other's arms while posing for the camera with the vertical steel slats of the border fence in the background. Their arms are touching, signaling the ways in which the meeting together of bodies and skin helps to bring a form of tenderness to the violent space of the border. Written on each steel slat are painted words like dignidad, no más frontera, todas tienen derechos, dignity, no more wall, all have rights. The word todas is gendered, using the feminine version of the noun. The words are neither carefully sketched nor intricately painted. Sometimes they're even scribbled onto the steel slats for space, and thus they exemplify an everyday sensibility in which the border is touched to represent new meaning. The focus is Jocelyn and Stephanie, who are both wearing tiaras and fiercely staring into the camera's eye. Behind the fence are some of their allies in the US who traveled to Nogales to support the caravan. By eating a paleta, a popsicle, Stephanie breaks from the norms and forms of the spectacular, typically how migrants are depicted in these spectacular forms of violence, highlighting the everyday action of eating a paleta on a hot summer day in the Sonoran desert. Taracena's staging of the everyday and the hyper-feminine together creates an avenue for pleasure and tenderness in the face of state power. This pleasure emerges from and resides at the border, making this image imbued with meaning. Pain and trauma are significant markers of migration, but this type of representation of migration can also attest to the joys and pleasures that traverse through the embodiment of femininity and through coalitions. Seeing through this dual lens allows us to see the power that migrants hold. After all, in the image, Jocelyn and Stephanie are neither smiling nor crying. They are holding on to each other. They hold their ground as migrants who insist on their survival, subjects who insist on their existence. They evoke sensualities and sexualities that will not be contained by the nation. The pain, loss, and suffering that they have experienced in their home countries and at the border cannot be fully represented through photojournalism. However, Taracena frames this image in such a way that meaning abounds through the setting of the border. Accordingly, the pain that the members of Rainbow Seven Tier endure cannot be healed through visual representation. This pain, however, can be a site of connection as seen in the action of holding on to each other's arms. Instead of shocking the viewer with images of violence, Taracena's photojournalistic lens teaches the world to revel in the presence of the trans gay caravan and their visual manifestations. The main takeaway from these visual representations of queer and trans migrants is that these type of diasporas and movements challenge the heteronormative borders of the nation. And I want to close with a chant and analysis of one chant from the protest, in which a lot of the members stated, make it tremble, make immigration controls tremble. America is a house without nation. Make them tremble, make misogynist men tremble. America will be transfeminista. And the Spanish version is que tiemble, migración. América Unida es una casa sin nación. Que tiemblen los machistas. América Unida será transfeminista. Not only is this chant a strong critique of nationalism, but it threatens the sexist, misogynist, and transphobic structures of the nation and dominant notions of diaspora at large. And instead of merely providing visibility, this type of representation of migrants performatively asserts that trans women and gay men from different locations have the power to come together in the face of transnational displacement. Thank you all.
Thanks so much, Ruben. Next, we'll hear from Dan Taulapapa McMullin. Dan is an artist and poet from American Samoa. Their artist book, The Healer's Wound, A Queer History of Polynesia, was published for the 2022 Hawaii Triennial, and their book of poems, Coconut Milk, was on the American Library Association Rainbow List Top 10 Books of the Year. Their work has been shown at the Museum of Modern Art, the Museum of Contemporary Native Art, the Metropolitan Museum, the De Young Museum, the Honolulu Museum, and the Venice Biennale. Their film, Sinalela, won the 2002 Honolulu Rainbow Film Festival Best Short Film Award. Dan.
Thank you, Ari. My name is Dan Taulapapa McMullin. I'm from American Samoa. In American Samoa, we have a culture, the Fa'afine culture, which means the way of a woman. And it sort of embraces the transgender community and the non-binary and gay community. In my book, The Healer's Wound, I was attempting to, from an artist's perspective and from a poet's perspective, I was attempting to find the history of, the queer history of Polynesia. Polynesia was, the old religion of Polynesia changed in the 1830s, and in Samoa, which is where I'm from, Samoa is divided into two countries, independent Samoa, which is the western islands of Samoa, and American Samoa, which is the eastern islands of Samoa, where my parents are from. And in this book, I spent several years researching the queer history of Polynesia. And from this, I created images from old photographs that I colorized and manipulated on Photoshop. And I used texts from indigenous texts and colonial texts. One of the historical histories that was interesting to me was the queer history in Florida, and this kind of influenced my own research. There was a Native American queer history in Florida that was suppressed, and the healers were murdered en masse by the Spanish colonial powers. And so this kind of, to me, reflected on the healing tradition within queer cultures in Polynesia, Polynesia being the Pacific Islands from Hawaii to New Zealand, or Aotearoa. Next image, please. One of the stories I found, and it doesn't exist in the historical archive in Samoa any longer, although it was recorded from two orators from Manua, where my family is from, my mother's family. But it was recorded by a missionary. And a lot of these stories were not seen by the missionaries as necessarily queer stories. So in that sense, they survived in the archive. A lot of words that were in Polynesian languages, like Aikane in Hawaiian and Fa'afafine in Samoan, which were queer words, you could say. I mean, queer is not a Polynesian word, but you could say they were sort of sanitized in their translations into English and into French and the different colonial languages. There was one story that I found in my research that was recorded by a missionary, but they got the story from Tauanu'u and Fofo of Manua, which is islands of eastern Samoa. And I'll read the story. On the formation of two bodies being complete, they lived, but were both males, and dwelt on land on which they were formed. One day, whilst fishing with a net called a wha'amutu, one of them was injured by a small fish called the lo, which caused his death. Upon this, Tuli, and that's the golden plover, you see, the bird, returned to the skies and bewailed the loss of one of the inhabitants of his land to his father, when Laitosi was directed by Tangaloa to proceed to the earth to reanimate the dead body, previously to which, however, he changed the sex of the deceased male to that of a female. The two then became man and wife, and the parents of the human race. And so you see here the creation story of Samoa is itself a story of transgenderism, of two males, one of whom becomes a female. And this to me is indicative of how queer cultures were integral to what it was to be Polynesian within the polytheistic religion of 200 years ago in Polynesia, which is still honored to a great degree in ceremonies and in political meetings in Samoa and throughout Polynesia. The image is of two young Samoan men. It was taken by a Western photographer in the 1880s visiting Samoa. I don't know if they're queer. I think the photographer was queer. It's very much about the colonial gaze. But in other images, I could definitely reclaim them as queer. In this image, I think you see kind of the intimacy of Samoan men with each other. And I remember when I was young, it was common among men in our family to kiss each other when they greeted, and now they hug each other. So it's kind of this kind of continual change. Next image, please. in my research, I began looking for fa'afafine, again, fa'afafine being our queer term for men who live as women, fa'a meaning the way of, and fa'afine meaning a woman, fa'afafine. The figure on your right is a photo from about the 1870s that I colorized by John Davis, who was an English photographer who lived in Samoa and took many pictures of this particular individual who's anonymous, but whom I identify as Fa'afafine. It's a photograph in the British Museum. The top knot on the hair, when this photograph was taken, Samoa had been Christianized for about 40 years, and but it was still in transition. There were villages that were Christianized, and there were villages that were polytheistic in the old religion. And the way you could tell, by 1870, it was pretty much all Christianized. But the way you could tell was the difference between the villages was in the old culture, women had short hair and men had long hair. And when the missionaries came, they told the women to grow their hair long, and they made the men cut their hair short. And they also made, in the old religion, all Samoans had a spirit guide. When they were born, there was an animal or fish or bird, or sometimes a tree, or even a stone sometimes, a place. But usually it was like a bird or fish. That was their spirit guide. And when they became Christians, missionaries, to prove they were Christian, they had to eat that animal. And this was the beginning of the suppression of queer cultures in Polynesia and in Samoa. Was the Captain Cook, when he came to Hawaii, he was very offended. He was the first Westerner to come to Tahiti in Hawaii and record the cultures there in a kind of scientific manner. And he was very offended by the homosexuality that he saw that was very open. He was very offended by the transgenderism that he saw that was very open. And his officer also, Captain Bligh, who was the same captain from the mutiny on the Bounty, who was an officer with Captain Cook, he also was very interested in the transgenders, especially the young transgenders, and he would make them disrobe in front of him and reveal themselves because he was curious about their actual gender. So part of my research is to look at these texts and to look at these images in order to find our history and to establish ourselves as queer people within the history of Polynesia. When I was young, we migrated from American Samoa to California, and I remember some Fa'afine relatives were visiting us, but because my parents were acculturated to American culture and were in the evangelical church and were Republicans and all this, they were very, they didn't like the displays of Fa'afine culture. So when the Fa'afine visited our family, they dressed as men. And this happened a lot with Fa'afine as they came to the United States. The United States was not necessarily a refuge for the queer cultures of Polynesia. I'm talking like the 40s and the 50s. But in time, largely due to the activities of the evangelical church, as they do in Uganda and places of Africa, they began working with politicians to create laws to suppress homosexuality and to suppress transgenderism within cultures that originally were supportive of homosexuality and transgenderism. So the New Zealand government, which controlled Western Samoa, and the American government, which controlled American Samoa, created laws about cross-dressing and kinds of laws. Next image, please. So that ship you saw is an old ship of an aliyah, which is a traditional sailing vessel in Samoa, and the figure on the right in the previous image was young Fafine, as I identified. And here we see the ship in the water, which is in kind of the shallows of the reef. And there's a figure standing in the water. And I also identify this figure as Fafine. This photo was taken in, I believe, the 1890s. In part due to the way the person is dressed, to the hair, which is a little longer than kind of the male tradition, but mainly because this anonymous figure is standing in the water. And on these warships, there was a young Fafafine on the prow of the ship. That also is kind of indicative of taupo status, which is a young female person who is at the beginning of a war party. They stand at the lead of a war party. And but there is also a rule about females standing on ships of war. And so I believe that is why this figure is standing in the water. That's because they are Fafafine. They do identify within the feminine. And so they're not standing on the ship, they're standing in the water. Next image, please. So when the missionaries and when the colonial powers in New Zealand or Aotearoa, where the Polynesian Maori live, within Hawaii, where the Kanaka Maoli or Kanaka Oiwi, the indigenous Native Hawaiians live, there was an intentional suppression of stories that were overly sexual or overly queer in the recordings by the colonial recorders of indigenous knowledge in Hawaiian, and a lot of these people married Polynesians. There were a lot of them were Gray in New Zealand was the governor of New Zealand. Fornander, who collected a lot of the Hawaiian mo'olelo or stories, was a judge and was married to a Hawaiian, I believe. And so they were fluent in Polynesian languages, but they were also censorious. They censored what they recorded. Now, Fornander recorded a lot of stories of Aikane. Aikane were young men who, in Hawaii, and who were like apprentices or squires, and they were the beloved of male and female chiefs, these young men, and they're called Aikane. And Captain Cook was offended that King Kamehameha, the king of Hawaii, had all these young male lovers, Aikane. But when Fornander recorded the mo'olelo, he changed the meaning of the word Aikane. He sanitized it. He said that the Aikane was a platonic relationship. They were not lovers. So a lot of these stories survived of men who, when you read those stories in Hawaiian, they obviously were lovers, but when you read them in English, it's sanitized in such a way that they seem to be friends, even though one chief might leave his female wife to have a male husband. And if you look at the meaning of the word tane, or kane in the word Aikane, the word tane in Samoan, a woman who lives as a man, is called fa'atane. The word tane means man, but it also means a husband. The word fa'afine means woman, but it also means a wife. And so, and it's very strange now that in American Samoa, although the United States has made marriage equality legal throughout the 50 states, in the territories, there's still an issue with this because of the rise of the evangelical church within these colonial spaces like American Samoa and places in Africa and places throughout the world where, and I see I'm out of time. So next image, I'll just kind of run through these. But these are that was a group of Hawaiian priests who served Lono, and they were all mahu. This is a young drag performer from the 1960s, Prince Hanalei. Next image. In my images, in my paintings, is a painting in the Interior Museum in Washington, D.C., of a young Fafine based on a photograph. Next image. And this is a painting showing at the Musée de la Civilisation in Montreal of Fafine. Next image. And now I'm working with artificial intelligence to kind of recreate some histories that I don't have images for. So doing these images. Sorry for going over time.
No problem. That was fascinating and a really wonderful presentation. Thanks, Dan. And moving on to our final presenter, Rajiv Mohabir. Rajiv is an Indo-Caribbean American author of 3 acclaimed poetry collections, The Taxidermist's Cut, Cowherd's Son, and Cutlish. He's also authored a book of translation, I Even Regret Night, and has a hybrid memoir, Anti-Man, which I believe he's going to discuss further. He's the winner of numerous prizes, including the National Book Critics Circle Award for Poetry. He received his MFA in Poetry and Translation from Queen's College, CUNY, and his PhD in English from the University of Hawaii. And Rajiv is currently a professor at Emerson College. Rajiv.
Thank you so much, Ari. I'll just add, actually, really quickly, I was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. I could only wish that I won it. So thank you for that. Thank you to all of the panelists who have already spoken. This has been so incredible to hear you all. And thank you so much to the organizers. I'm going to share my screen with you. You will now see my presentation, yay, which is called The Coolie Anti-Man. When it comes to the diaspora of the Indo-Caribbean experience, there are multiple valences of queerness that come into play. North American queerness as a hegemonic power and its corollary created homophobias, exert undue pressure on Caribbean experience when also mapped in the United States hubs of Caribbean communities, such as New York City, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, etc. I think through the figure of the anti-man in my own writing to show a brown and black queerness that also exposes the porous boundaries of gender categories. I come to the ideas of queerness from the experiences of a racialized subject of American empire, presently on the stolen and occupied lands of the Pawtucket Confederacy that reaches from what is colonially known as Malden up and through Maine and into parts of Canada. These are also called the Dawnlands. I speak as a poet and writer from this space. When considering the multiple valences of queerness and LGBTQIA+ experiences that form me, I arrive at the Kalapani again and again. The Kalapani, or black water, is that static moment of frenzy where the migrant becomes how the migrant is read by the dominant eye, where ideas of community and of self are in flux. For me and for my family and familial history, this means literal crossing of the ocean. It's from these ships in the 1800s that crossed from India to Guyana that my own contract-bound ancestors were moored to global economy and given the name coolie, a title, while caste marking in the South Asian subcontinent, was a name derived from the work category that South Asians played for the British Empire. We constructed a new community embracing the Victorian English normatives for conduct and behaviors in public space, calling ourselves things like Jahaji Bhai, or brother of the ship. With this adoption of cultural British and creolized normatives came the rampant homophobia that people from the United States now associate with the Caribbean. As such, the term Jahaji Bhai seeks its alignment with the cisgender heteropatriarchy. As the queer Indo-Caribbean scholar Suzanne Parsard says, of this colonial configuration, Traditional paradigms of Indo-Caribbean thought, such as Jahaji Bhai narratives, work to suture heterosexuality to normative Indo-Caribbean culture and identity that, by extension, position queerness either as foreign or a recent viral pollutant to Indo-Caribbean spaces. This is not to say that individuals of the Indo-Caribbean diaspora do not seek to conform to these normatives still. Rather, it shows the quadrants queernesses inhabit. So many people have criticized the use of Hindu religious myth to pretend as though, through a Hindutva lens, that Hinduism taught acceptance from time immemorial, and that the othering of queers was due to Mughal and/or colonial contact. This is also a myth, wielded by the genocidal Indian right wing to show the animal of the other. The idea of the barbarian as homophobe, the pristine, untouched Hindu India as advanced. I'll touch on this in a bit. If this were indeed the case, why then were conservative internet trolls calling for my lynching and public execution, both if I ever go to India again and in New York City where I used to live, because of a poem I wrote imagining Krishna as a lover? In June of 2021, the Voices of Bhakti posted my poem, The Cowherd's Son, on their Instagram account. Ironically, pointedly, at Pride Month. Pride and what that means garners, for me, a very horny eye roll. For me, the poem shows my displacement from India, from Guyana, from religion, and from the queer community of Indo-Caribbeans that were my home in New York. I'll read this poem for you to show how migration has caused me to sin in the eyes of the pure, who we know wear the blood of the innocent. And a little bit about this poem is that I reimagine the promiscuity of the deva, of the god, Krishna, as something that I queer, much like my relationship to the Caribbean, to Guyana, to Hindi language, and to Hinduism, as well as India, I guess. I am angry about religion, about the divisions it maintains, the ways my parents had to abandon their own traditions for the sake of assimilation into a hostile country where I grew up, the way Hinduism disavows and complicated heritage, the way Christianity preys on the vulnerable still. All the names that I use in this poem are names of Krishna. And I'm not sorry for my various ways of being a bastard, my mixedness, my mixed castness, my queernesses. I write in the vocabularies of indenture across the Indo-Caribbean diasporic landscape and hope to add my poetic proclivities and obsessions, my own queer voice and my own version of diasporic brownness to this landscape, or seascape. This poem is called The Cowherd's Son. O Krishna, O flautist, what thrill to wind another's flute, to have fingers guide air, stop its prayers leaking from holes plugged with pads and mantras. My prayers are hollow reeds or shells whose mollusks I fricasseed. My love tasted of sea and relics, the tooth of Gautama, the finger of the Baptist, locusts and wild honey. For its music, I punch gaps into his femur and press this flute to my lips, to Pied Piper Hindu twinks in Queens out of bikini briefs. I mix rum in my milk and we suck spirits down all day long and Jai Jagadish Hare on Sunday morning. O Kanhaiya, O Madhav, my father Ahiri, my mother Brahmin, now both Christian carnivores. Mixed caste and queer countryed, I'm untouchable, the only Mohabir left who still scores your shlokas. But what is queerness in diaspora when we have to fit ourselves into neat categories for others to understand us, or to even give a damn about our lives? Are our lives grievable in the end? Ask the countless dead from the pandemics in the United States. But there's a real dilemma when encountering our personhoods here in the US. Joseph Boone talks about this in his article, Vacation Cruises, or the Homoerotics of Orientalism, and I think it remains applicable for how others see queer Indo-Caribbean people in the United States, and how we in the Indo-Caribbean diaspora see those in our own homes, or our ideas of home countries. And for me and my family, that's Guyana. Other folks, Trinidad, Jamaica, etc. He writes, and it's here on the screen, showing how contingent and Western its concept of homosexuality as an identity category, a sexual practice, and a site of theoretical speculation often proves to be when brought into contact with the sexual epistemologies of non-Western cultures, particularly when encounters of the East and West are crossed by issues of colonialism, race, nation, and class. These encounters have been based on power differentials and exploited by Western tourists who sought solace for their perverse sexualities in the West. And this reminds me of how the colonizers, the British, treated the Indian indentured laborers in the colonies in the 1800s. Of course, there has been this kind of colonial exchange that haunts people still. No matter how removed we are from the days of national decolonization, the psychic trauma still remains. The haunting of the Anti-Buggery Acts and the laws written in the 1500s by King Henry VIII still appear in the laws of the former colonies, as in Guyana, my parents' natal country. And in Trinidad also, until recently, which was struck down. And in Nature's Wild, Love, Sex, and Law in the Caribbean, Undil Gosine writes, in their most basic essence, the anti-sodomy laws constituted animals so that humans could be made. The colonial production of images of indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, and indentured Indians as animalistic in order to justify their abuse, exploitation, and genocide, in turn, defined the colonizing settler as human. Gosine then goes on to trace the evolution of this idea into a colonial and neo-colonial mandate that, ironically, and despite their creating these conditions of homophobia themselves, the colonizer becomes less animal than the Caribbean subject, ready to recuse brown and black queers from the homophobic Caribbean governance. Gosine goes on to state that of the homonationalists normalizing North American and European queer internationalist move, that in the colonial era, people in the global South were commonly imagined as monstrous figures who were bestial, homosexual, or both. But following the normalization of homosexuality in Western Europe and North America, a new kind of animal has been produced, the non-white heterosexual homophobe. And this certainly extends to the people from the Caribbean in the global North, in Caribbean communities, imagining our home communities in the global South. And staying with Undil Gosine a little bit longer, he goes on to interview the activist in Trinidad called Joel Simpson in 2018, who says the people in diaspora, the people who are also controlling funding can't be running our show. And he says this about kind of North American queer imperialism as we look to the Caribbean. This migration between places, South Asia to the Caribbean to the United States, in my family story, also Canada and the UK are certainly included. This migration has definitely influenced my ideas of self and belonging in ways that I cannot always trace. And as a writer, I'm drawn to the interstices, those margins charged with queer potential, that place of the coolie anti-man. You see, I use the term coolie here, and I spell it with a Q to practice a form of différance, to illustrate the centering of a queer coolie subject that also hides in plain sight. This is an idea by the academic Ryan Persadi, who's a scholar as well as a drag queen who lives in Toronto, who says in his article, "Me just realize Isaac Coulibaly, Indo-Caribbean Masculinities, Chutney Genealogies and Coolie Subjectivities." He says, "My reading of queer here is not meant to articulate sexual and gender difference as a category of absolute being, as used often in the global North, LGBTQ+ mainstream organizing and activism, but as a practice, method, and a doing of transgressive and erotic self-making. I take this term and I pair it with the word anti-man, which is a gender creative and sexually diverse category that I am attempting to reclaim in the diaspora as I have indeed titled my memoir after this word. It is charged and a way of showing Black and brown queerness as it exists outside of the North American gaze while occurring in North America simultaneously. An anti-man can be LGBTQIA+ in all of its diverse arrays of configuration. The word can be used and mobilized slyly to elide definition and being ruled because of that definition from the outside. And what I'll do now in order to end my time with you today is to, or excuse me, my portion of this panel is to read for you from the author's note of this memoir, Anti-Man. And hopefully what this will do will wind all of these threads together, that of the Kuli Anti-Man, the Indo-Caribbean history that I'm talking about, queer diaspora, and ultimately hinting at the answer to the question, can the LGBTQIA+ community be considered its own diaspora? And this is the cover of the book. Isn't it beautiful? Oh, I just loved when the publisher was like, here's the cover. And I'm like, I got a pink book. Hell yeah. And it's called Anti-Man. Man, I felt so lucky. Here we go, author's note. In this memoir, I have changed many names, places, and relationships in order to keep the spirits appeased. Protecting kin is the work of the ancestors, but so too is speaking truth. I have represented the emotional truths that have led me up to the present, this crucible of years, which I discovered the poetry that also discovered me. I have chosen the title Anti-Man, consciously aware that it is upsetting, that the term is a violent one. I use it in order to shift its heaviness and release the trap of its letters to embody it with a flourish, despite those who would use it to condemn and damn. Those who are not familiar with the Caribbean slur may hear it as anti-man, against man, which could have been the title, truly. Another mishearing of the word anti-man as though before man is also apt. To my nibblings, I am very much an auntie-man, be I cha-cha, uncle, or mamu. The word anti-man represents and holds a history for me, one of migration and survival. This is my own accounting of events as I remember them. I was entrusted with my Aji's, my grandmother's only possessions, her melodies and words in her dying language of Guyanese Bhojpuri. They were seedlings from India, grown in the plantations of Berbice in Guyana, and pressed for their sweetness in Orlando, Toronto, and New York. And I will end there. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Rajiv. That was wonderful and thought-provoking as well. I have a million questions for everyone, and I know we have limited time. There are some questions in the Q&A that I'll try to weave in, and I have some maybe specific questions for folks, but I really invite all the panelists to weigh in if you have thoughts. Perhaps we can start. There's one question from a participant about the current westernized use of the word queer, and to what extent that's no longer accurate. Is it outdated and limiting? And I wonder if we can use that to open sort of a broader discussion too. Rajiv and Dan, you both talked about the links between colonialism and the repression of queer culture, the colonial origins of homophobia and transphobia, and we still see that today in driving many of the migrants that Anja and Ruben discussed at the top two. And I wonder how you see, or to what extent you see queer culture, the existence of queer people and queer community as an anti-colonial project. This is clearly part of sort of your work, Rajiv. I wonder to the question of the participant or the attendee, can we think of sort of queerness overall as an anti-colonial project, or is that word itself sort of too embedded in kind of Western or hegemonic ideas about what it means to be queer or a queer person? I don't know who wants to start.
Maybe I'll jump in. In my book, The Healer's Wound, I ended around 1970 because I wanted to go back and look at the formation of queer cultures of Polynesia. And after 1970, I'm 65, so after 1970, there's all kinds of fabulousness going on with younger generations. And but also I want to kind of chronicle a lot of suppression that I experienced when I was young. And the way to chronicle it was to look at the suppression of history. In the U.S., the Polynesian and the Pacific Islander community has a group called Utopia. But also when I was looking into this history, there were houses in Apia and in Pongo, Apia being in independent Samoa and Pongo being in American Samoa. There was a house called Hollywood in Apia, and there's a house called Beverly Hills in Pongo. And these were transgender houses where people would come from the villages and they'd come to the city and they would sew and they would make a living tailoring. So I don't know if I lost track of the question, but I guess what I'm saying is, and also speaking to what Anja said about when people look for freedom, they often find themselves in another place that's a whole different set of freedoms, but also of different kinds of suppression. And so that's when, as Ruben very beautifully spoke of communities that came over the border, people cling to each other, but not just, I mean, yes, absolutely for survival, but also for culture and for language and for very particular cultures, which is the history I'm trying to uncover. Very particular cultures that are connected to language and that are connected to histories that we would, I think, do well to honor and to try to sort out for ourselves.
Rajiv, just if I can extend that or maybe sort of rephrase what I was thinking in the question as well, is any queerness sort of by definition anti-colonial or anti-imperial, or is the idea of queerness itself or representations of queerness inextricably sort of bound up in kind of colonialism or sort of neo-colonial exports from other parts of the world?
Yeah, thank you. I think there's these implications, with when it comes to organizations that are interacting from North America to the Caribbean. There's, the Caribbean Equality Project is a nonprofit that is based in New York City, and they're doing some really great work with queer migrants and refugees from the Caribbean. They are in conversation with, let's say, SASOD, which is also like an LGBTQ plus organization in Guyana itself. And so, there are these tensions that arise sometimes of like, okay, well, how are we from, the West of, this incredibly privileged passport, looking and labeling people based on where we're from. And so, yeah, I mean, in the past, that has always been, an issue in terms of how we locate not just our, not how we define ourselves in a place that is hostile and racist, but also how we try to make the people from the origin, the imaginary homeland, conform to our own privileged thoughts. So there's like these layers of how that works. I'll say queerness, like, to echo the first sentence of Jose Munoz, Closing Utopias, queerness is always on the horizon. I think that what he was getting at was that we can't possibly know the incredible nuances of all of like the ways that identities happen, except for this idea that has a deferred realization. And I think that this also trades in, strategic essentialism, to be easily identified and labeled, and that is from Spivak, who has since recanted the idea of strategic essentialism actually being beneficial in the long run. But this is like, now we can talk about the material reality of queers who are being persecuted in these different countries. This is the ideological thing. But when it comes to like access and money and, saving potential lives, then the conversation becomes grounded in a kind of like materialism, let's say. Like there's like a reality of funding and budgets and this. And so, yeah, I guess I'm not answering your question, but I'm kind of poking your question. Hopefully that that kind of margin is okay to be in at the moment, because I can't rightly say that it is always anti-colonial. I think it really just depends on where you are looking and what is being contested.
Ruben, there's a question from the audience about whether you know what happened to the women of the trans caravan. Where are they? Have they been able to continue community? I also wonder if I can sort of tack on a question to that for you. I think you draw this really striking contrast between representation of queer migrants by Taracena, which focuses on a sort of beautiful humanity, a femininity, the sort of everydayness of, you know, eating a paleta like you showed, compared to what we see most often in the news, right? And I wonder if you have a sense of what the impacts of that kind of violent representation are on the both the politics around sort of, you know, queer migration or trans migrants and the communities themselves.
Yeah, and it's a loaded question. And I say this because kind of like the question with queer too, I really like this idea of, you know, like queer is strategic. In the trans gay caravan, they utilize gay rather than queer. They didn't equate queer as like the umbrella term. And I think I also love that it's trans beside queer. And Francisco Galarte, in his book Brown Transfigurations, he talks about what does it mean to put trans beside queer, not against each other, but just existing beside one another. And I bring this up because, again, is to talk about the material realities of these terms, what these terms aim to do and their limitations. What does visibility aim to do? The very same visibility that the trans women and the gay men were drawing on is the same visibility that ends up putting them in danger at the same time, as a lot of them experience sexual assault through their crossing from Central America to the US, and the danger and detention centers of sexual assault for LGBTQ migrants. The statistics are horrible. To answer the question of what happened to them, all of the trans women were released on their parole after a month. Many of them have found communities. I lived in Tucson for a while. I saw a few of them working with Mariposas Sin Fronteras, which is a Tucson LGBTQ migrant rights organization. With the gay men, I think only one of them was able to be released after months in detention, and the rest of them, they couldn't prove credible fear of persecution. So a lot of them were told basically to self-deport. So again, and these are complicated questions on what happens. But I think I just want to pinpoint, like, you know, the language practice. Like at one point they have a chant where they're like, "Que perra mi amiga," they're calling each other bitches in one of their chants, just to show that, again, language is provisional, and that people play with language depending on the context and depending on the use, just like visibility. But yes, luckily a lot of the trans women were able to do this, and I want to say that a lot of activist organizations helped them prepare for this demonstration. This wasn't done just randomly, but they had a lot of help from like the Transgender Law Center, Mariposas Sin Fronteras, and many orgs that helped make this happen.
Anja, I wonder if I can turn to you. You know, getting at this idea of a queer diaspora, a queer diasporic community, in the work that you do with ORAM and in the conversations you have with folks that you work with communities that you work with on the ground. Do you have a sense of whether you know, the refugees that you work with feel a part of a sort of queer community? Do they feel that they're receiving assistance or resources, that they can look to a sort of broader or global queer community for support? Or is that sense of kind of isolation that you described that so characterizes, I think, the migratory journey for a lot of queer refugees, kind of more of the defining experience?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. And I think it really depends on where they are and who we're talking about. So, for instance, we do a lot of work in Kenya, both in a refugee camp and then in Nairobi. And there, you know, there are many who have fled Uganda, and there are many more becoming now with the new bill. And because they have been there for such a long time, they've actually managed to kind of organize themselves into community-based organizations. They have safe houses. They've really built this strong community. And I mean, it's amazing to see, you know, what they're able to go through together and how they're able to support each other. and how they're able to, fundraise for the wider community and just the advocacy that they've done around their rights in Kenya. They're also often quite connected to the global community as well. There's a lot of outreach being done via Facebook and Instagram and Reddit, and a lot of support going through that then. I will say, though, that sometimes that support can kind of backfire a little bit as well when people don't really know the challenges that people are going through on the ground. Just providing support can maybe kind of go to, the wrong hands, or not be the tailored support that they actually need as a wider community, as opposed to maybe just supporting one individual. There's also, sadly, a lot of issues of kind of credibility of claims as well when it comes to that. So that those are all things to keep in mind. But sadly, when we're speaking about, LGBTQ refugees, the ones who are most vulnerable within this vulnerable community are those that, for instance, aren't able to reach out to the global community via Facebook, Instagram, because, they maybe can't write, they maybe have language barriers because they don't speak any languages that would be spoken in these countries in, Northern America or Western Europe, and they don't have access to, they don't have smartphones, they don't have computers, they don't have access to internet. So that's really then how they are the ones who are most isolated, and usually those who are most in need as well. And then when it comes to those who get resettled, you can't choose where you actually get resettled to. So the way it works is governments handpick individuals that they want to accept, and then they place you. So, we've had many people that have gotten resettled to states in the US that maybe wouldn't be the states that they would necessarily choose to go to, because again, there won't be communities there that they can relate to, or that they can find that support that they need. And, that's one thing that's really important when it does come to resettlement and advocating around this, is that making sure that people are placed, in bigger cities, in more welcoming states, and places where there are these support mechanisms that they need, so that their isolation doesn't just continue once they do reach these safe third countries as well.
I see that we're coming up on time, so maybe if I could just to try to conclude, sort of turn that question back to folks as well, which is that given all of these needs that we've just identified, and the sort of complications and challenges that have been discussed, I know folks often ask me sort of what they can do to help or to be more engaged on these issues, and for folks who may be listening in who have that same question, I wonder, Anja, if in your work and if others have any thoughts about sort of what people can do to either sort of directly support queer migrants and refugees, or sort of more broadly in terms of kind of the politics or the culture around these issues.
I think there's a lot that people can do, locally, and again, advocating with, local authorities, government, to open up more spots for resettlement of specifically LGBTIQ refugees. Then also just opening of borders, allowing people to actually cross borders to be able to claim asylum, because, for instance, what was and is happening at the US-Mexico border, it's completely against any international law. And there are things that can be done locally. And I often think that we're very quick to criticize governments in the global South that are receiving millions of refugees. But they're struggling maybe with employment for their own nationals as well. And there are so many issues there. And yet we're very quick to criticize them and how they're accepting. And yet we're not willing to take in our fair share. And that's, even worse in Europe, actually, where I am as well. So I think, that's something that we need to check ourselves and look what we can do locally. And then just, advocate for queer migration to be a topic in kind of the broader humanitarian space, and mainstream refugee organizations that will often kind of just bunch in LGBTIQ refugees into services that they generally provide, but not really tailor the support to what their needs are. And then when it comes to, direct support, of course, I'll say this because I work for an NGO, is really try and find organizations, and I'm not even just saying maybe US-based ones, but local organizations, and maybe provide support through them, because they'll know how to get the right support to the right individuals as well, and how to really make sure that you're being culturally sensitive as well when you're doing your advocacy and support to the community.
And any other final thoughts from the other panelists on your work on queer diaspora, on queer migration? These are big topics and big questions that we're just scratching the surface of.
I'll say really quickly that one of the things that I would advocate for as a writer and a poet is to support queer migrant writers and people who have come from other places who have been persecuted for what they've done and who are writing. There are folks in all over the country of the United States anyway, and all over the world, who are going through this and who also are making this wonderful art. Ruben, you shared some with in a book that you co-edited, I believe, and that's just really fantastic. But then also, there are organizations like the Caribbean Equality Project, who are working with people who don't have papers to bring them into citizenship or paths to citizenship, and that work is so incredibly important.
And I was part of that co-edited book, Queer and Transmigration. So I think that educational element, also supporting the artists, writers, the orgs, Familia, Trans Queer Liberation Movement. And instead of supporting the American Dirt writers, there are queer and trans migrant writers, Sonia Guillansaka, Alan Pelas, the list goes on. So supporting actual queer and trans migrants who are usually at the forefront of liberation movements and yet are not always recognized in interesting ways.
And Dan, any final thoughts? Not to put you on the spot.
Just to reiterate what Anja and Rajiv and Ruben said, and to say that it's a very diverse community, and it contributes to, certainly in the United States, historically and in contemporary culture, in really interesting ways into the world culture. So, yeah, and thank you.
That's a terrific note to end on, and a truly outstanding panel. And as I said, these are big questions that we've really just begun to sort of dig into. So I hope this is just the start of a lot of future conversations, both among us and for folks in attendance as well. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Giselle and the UCLA team.
Thank you, everybody, for attending the program. I hope you enjoyed the presentations and learned as much as I did. Before we end the session, I just want to remind everybody to please fill out the survey that will appear upon exiting the Zoom session. Also, please be sure to check out the final 2 programs in the series, Traditions in Diaspora on April 18th and Bruins Belong, a student showcase on April 19th. Thank you again to our attendees, and thank you to our amazing speakers and to our moderator. I hope you all have a wonderful day.